morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Heike Weirens. I'm currently the president of the Society for Ethnobotany. And I welcome you to one of the irregular events that we are doing that are focused on subjects that are not as amenable to a conference format. So we can talk a little bit longer. We can talk about other things. And our guest today is a member of the Council of the Society for Ethnobotany, David Picking, Dr. David Picking. He is at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. He's originally from the UK, trained as a herbalist. And the project that he is going to present today, which is a large database project, came out of his PhD, like a lot of our life projects, right? So David, welcome and thank you. And let's hear you.
Right, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to present today. Just checking in with everybody. Can everyone see the screen okay? Hopefully you can see an image of, that's actually Bryophyllum pinnatum, or leaf of life, in beautiful flowers. So yeah, I'm going to talk about TRAMIL. So for people who don't know TRAMIL, hopefully by the end of the session, you'll have a more in-depth understanding of what the TRAMIL organization is and the TRAMIL database is, and the Caribbean Herbal Pharmacopeia. Certainly when I came to Jamaica in 2008, I had no awareness of it. So let me make a start. So as I said, just a little bit of background. Later in life, I went back to university and trained at the University of Westminster. It was a 5-year training as a naturopath and a medical herbalist. And then 2008 or 2007, I got awarded a Commonwealth Scholarship and came to Jamaica to undertake my PhD at the University of the West Indies at the Mona campus. So TRAMIL was really one of the first things that I got immersed in, because it was the first part of the PhD research that I undertook. So I arrived in Jamaica January 2008, and by February was planning to do an island-wide survey of medicinal plant use. And really TRAMIL was just this incredible resource for me, because it gave me a methodology, and the team I worked with a methodology to go out into the field and to undertake research. Because, you know, from the outset, I was trained as a medical herbalist. I was not a botanist or an ethnobotanist. So it was really an immersion of a baptism of fire. So in true kind of lecture style, what I want to cover is just a very brief, because there's a lot of information, and just to put a disclaimer on it, there's so much information, and the TRAMIL network is so interesting and has so much depth that I really can't cover it or do it justice in like a 1-hour presentation. But hopefully I'll be able to give some insights into it, which will have people interested to do a deeper dive and find out a lot more information from themselves. And I'm hoping there may actually be some of the TRAMIL collaborators on the call as well. So we may be able to get some Q&A going at the end. But feel free, if there's any major questions as I'm presenting, do feel free to jump in. So just a very brief overview of my TRAMIL journey, and then a brief history of TRAMIL. But what I want to focus mainly on is the TRAMIL methodology. Okay, so as I said, I came to Jamaica January 2008, and my first task for my field work was to undertake an island-wide survey using the TRAMIL methodology. Just checking in, everyone's hearing and seeing okay?
I am certainly. Yes, thank you.
Okay. So yeah, we put a team together, went out into the field, and the field work was really quite a life-changing experience for me. New in the Caribbean, new in Jamaica, to go out into the field, a newly trained medical herbalist who thought I knew quite a lot about medicinal plants and their use from a clinical perspective. But for me, actually, it was a very humbling experience because I realized how little I actually knew, not just in terms of not knowing about the plants that were in Jamaica, but just in terms of the depth and breadth of knowledge of ordinary Jamaicans of their medicinal plants and how they were using them and continue to use them on a day-to-day basis. So for me, that was a very humbling experience, and we got a huge amount of data. So we completed an island-wide representative survey of the Jamaican population. And we'll go more in, as I say, more into the actual methodology, but we looked at the health conditions that people were using. And also in a Jamaican context, a lot of Jamaicans use plants for health conditions, but they also use plants extensively to maintain health as well. There's a strong emphasis on health maintenance, the use of tonic herbs, for example. So the research focused on the health condition treated, detailing the medicinal plant use, and then demographic profiles. Now, we actually expanded the TRAMIL survey somewhat because I knew that a big part of my research was going to be looking into drug-herb interactions. So we took the opportunity while we were doing the TRAMIL survey to ask respondents about their use of medicinal plants in combination, if they took them in combination with pharmaceutical drugs. And that then led on to a lot of work that I did in the laboratory on drug interaction studies of specific plants. And so the results of that were, and I'll go into more detail about the TRAMIL workshops. So we presented the results of the survey at the 14th TRAMIL Scientific Workshop, which is in Cartagena in Colombia in 2012. And then subsequently went on to publish 2 papers in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, one focusing on the TRAMIL results and the other one focusing on the use of medicinal plants in combination with pharmaceutical drugs. Here's a picture. I think one of the amazing things about getting involved in TRAMIL is, from what I see, once you're involved in TRAMIL, it's kind of a lifetime commitment, because I see a lot of people who've been involved from early on who are still part of and at the heart of the TRAMIL network. And certainly I felt that. It's a very inclusive organization, and the workshops are an amazing opportunity that brings together people from really quite different backgrounds. And remember, you're talking multiple cultures and multiple languages, predominantly Spanish, French, and English across the region. So what is, looking at the brief history of TRAMIL, what is TRAMIL? So TRAMIL is an applied research program for the popular use of medicinal plants in the Caribbean. And by the Caribbean, and where does the name TRAMIL, I'm often asked this, and I've heard different responses depending on who you speak to. But again, with the different languages, my understanding is that it comes from traditional medicines in the islands. So the TRA, the M, and the IL, TRAMIL, comes from a rough kind of translation of that. But basically, TRAMIL covers the islands and the countries that border the Caribbean basin or the Caribbean Sea, as you can see in this diagram. So it's quite a significant number of countries. But what's the kind of the central vision and the understanding of what TRAMIL is about? So if I do a direct quote, and again, a lot of nearly all of the information I'm presenting here is on the TRAMIL website, which is www.tramil.net, and it's completely free and open to the public. So Emmanuel Nossin, who was the TRAMIL coordinator from 2008 to 2017 and is still a very active member, to quote him directly, with this vision that TRAMIL network appeared at the beginning of the 1980s, integrating researchers and health personnel convinced of the usefulness of a pan-Caribbean inclusive health system. Since then, the network has grown steadily to the point of having in its list today almost every country in the Caribbean region. And I think that's a fundamental aspect of TRAMIL, this idea of the use of medicinal plants and its role in primary healthcare across the region, and not as a separate discipline. And certainly when we published the TRAMIL paper, some of the quantitative data we had was that 72% of Jamaicans at that time, and I think even more so now, are using medicinal plants on a day-to-day basis to both maintain health and to treat particular health conditions. So Emmanuel also went on to say that the most important reason for the formation of TRAMIL is, and this is a very critical thing to this region, is a strong cultural convergence in this geographical area in the Caribbean. So we all know the tortured history of this great global crossroad where various populations crossed, European, African, Asian, Native American, and the resulting product of their blending led to the emergence of a true and unique traditional way of thinking expressed by naturalistic cultural representations relating to health and therapeutics. So two very, very key aspects underpinning what TRAMIL is about: the public health aspect and the recognition of this unique body of traditional knowledge that exists in the Caribbean. So the history formation probably traces itself back to 1982, is some of the first kind of records of TRAMIL activity. And a lot of that activity was at the time driven by this growing and very rapid growing awareness of an environmental crisis and concerns about biodiversity. As we know, the Caribbean is a hotspot for biodiversity, and there's great concern about the loss of biodiversity and the loss of traditional knowledge attached to that biodiversity. So there were four initial organizations that were key to its formation: the State University of Haiti, their Faculty of Medicine and Pharmacy, the state-owned rural clinic in Thomande, apologies if I've said that wrong, in Haiti, the Federation of Peasant Associations of Zambrana Chacuy in the Dominican Republic, and then an organization, CCRIB, who are still very actively involved, who are based in the Dominican Republic. And that's an international association involved in environment and development in developing countries. So the initial countries involved numbered about 9 countries: Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, Haiti, Mexico, Panama, and Venezuela. But that rapidly grew to where we are now today. I won't read all of the list, but now we have 27 countries who are actively participating in the TRAMIL network, including Jamaica from 2008. Well, Jamaica was involved before 2008, but our contribution in terms of a TRAMIL survey in 2012. So yeah, 26 countries. So what is the vision? The formal vision is to be the reference interdisciplinary program in the detection, the validation, and diffusion of the uses of medicinal plants that impact public health. And the mission of TRAMIL is to scientifically validate the traditional uses of plants for primary health care. So the methodology underpinning TRAMIL is based on the popular wisdom that enables communities to take charge of their own health problems and to establish the difference between simple belief and then provable efficacy. So the use of science to support that traditional knowledge, hopefully seeing, and I think TRAMIL is very much based on this idea of the power dynamic to ensure, that there's equity between the scientific community and communities. So traditional knowledge seen at the same level as the scientific rationale. So scientific studies carried out by a network of collaborators, the application of research with the objective of decreasing healthcare costs. Again, this idea of greater integration of traditional plant use into primary healthcare. And then making available to local communities, healthcare professionals, the practical knowledge for the treatment of common health problems with plant-based medicines. And as I've said already, the respecting of traditional knowledge and popular traditional practices. These are all of the things that underpin the TRAMIL methodology. Now, TRAMILers might tell me off for doing this, but the TRAMIL methodology, there's a lot to take on board, but I've kind of tried to break it down and identify some of the most significant steps. And again, the caveat here is there's a lot to unpick. So if I've missed things out, apologies now, but I'm hoping to give you an overview and a flavor of what the TRAMIL methodology actually involves. So I've identified 10 key steps. And again, all of this information is on the TRAMIL website. So the first step is, number one is the TRAMIL workshops. I mentioned the TRAMIL workshop in Cartagena. So to date, there have been 15 workshops. You can see the locations of those workshops on the map in 14 countries to date. So the role and the function of the TRAMIL workshops is bringing together this multidisciplinary team to look at the data that's been collected in surveys, to synthesize that data, and to make recommendations. So what I particularly like about the TRAMIL methodology is at the workshops, it's evolving and changing all the time. As you can imagine, nothing is static. So new people come on board, things are evolving and changing, and the methodology does so also. But what is beautiful about the TRAMIL workshops is this bringing together of a multidisciplinary team. So you get botanists, ethnobotanists, phytochemists, pharmacologists, doctors, and country people, and medical herbalists, people like me. So it's a very broad church of practitioners. So the first official TRAMIL workshop took place in 1984 in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. So again, all of this information on the website. There were reportedly 26 people took part in that first workshop from 2 different territories. They looked at 29 plants that have been studied. They identified, and we're going to go through what these terms mean in INV, REC, and TOX are terms that you'll see as we go through the methodology. But they identified 29 plants that were to be researched by the network. 43 plants, they hit the ground running. They had 43 plants based on the information that was available, 43 plants that immediately became recommended on the TRAMIL network. And then 7 plants that have been identified, but then were seen or found to be toxic. And again, we'll go into the methodology around identifying those plants that are considered toxic and not recommended for use by the TRAMIL network. And so just some of I put this name of lists up because many of the names appearing here, going back to 1984, are still actively involved in the TRAMIL network, and are very, very much part and parcel. And that's, I think, as I said, what I particularly like about TRAMIL is this longevity and consistency. Once you're in, you don't seem to leave. So number one is workshops. Then moving on to the second aspect is to identify the key health conditions. So the starting point for any piece of TRAMIL work is actually not the plants themselves, but the health conditions and the perception of those health conditions by the targeted community from which the information is sourced. So in each country, the starting point is to identify a list of health conditions that then form the basis of the investigation. And then the first survey question, when you're out in the field, relates to the health condition and its popular description. And then the second question then starts to look at, okay, so you've got this particular health condition. What are the plants that you've used to help with that, either to prevent it or to treat it? And this gives an example of groupings of some of those health conditions. This is actually going into the latest, not yet finished, but the latest printed version of the Pharmacopeia. So this, for example, talks about pain. So health conditions like discomfort, pain, fever, jaundice, breathing problems, coughs, colds, asthma, and flu would be some of those health conditions. Ear, eyes, and nose and throat, conjunctivitis, sore throat, toothache, etc. So we go around: digestive disturbance, colic, bellyache, gas, kidney stones, urinary disorders, gynecological problems, skin issues, and nerves and emotional symptoms, things like insomnia, anxiety, agitation. So that gives you an idea of some of the health conditions that people would identify in a particular country or community that you would focus on initially. Then you get into the survey itself, which is a participative ethnopharmacological survey. And these in green show the countries in which surveys have been conducted to date. And then I don't think there are any current surveys in progress, but the purple show that there are 4 planned surveys. For example, in the Bahamas, they're planning to do a survey. So to date, 50 surveys have been completed in 24 countries in the Caribbean area. So the surveys themselves, you're starting off looking at the number of respondents, defined based on the number of inhabitants and fixed by a statistician. So certainly in Jamaica, we identified, based on the total population, and then based on the parishes, and then we went down into what's called enumeration districts. And in each enumeration district, we got to the point where we knew how many households we had to interview, and then a skip pattern. So if you had 50 households in a small community, you knew you had to go to every 5th house, and that would give you your skip pattern. Okay, so the survey covers all of the population and doesn't limit itself to people. So you're not targeting people with medicinal plant knowledge. It's randomized. Now, TRAMIL traditionally, and I sometimes get into trouble for this, TRAMIL traditionally is focused on women and as holders of plant-based knowledge. And based on the culture in Jamaica, we decided not to focus on women and to completely randomize it. So when we went to our household, we would actually randomly select somebody in that household to interview. Okay. Then you're getting into the botanical identification, which is obviously in any survey is critical. So the collection and submission of voucher specimens to approved or appropriate herbaria. So the gatherer, the number, herbarium code, etc. So everything is publishable. And then the next step in the TRAMIL methodology, so that's you've done the survey, and then you're looking at shortlisting plant remedies with significant levels of use. And this forms the basis of the database, the TRAMIL database. So the plants that get shortlisted and entered into the TRAMIL Pharmacopoeia database is based on plants that are seen to be culturally significant, and this is based on frequency of citation. So most of us will know frequency of citation is based on the number of respondents using a plant remedy to treat a specific health condition as a percentage of the overall number of respondents who've used that plant remedy to treat the same condition. So we know that if we go out into the field and 100 people say that they use medicinal plants to treat headache, and then of those 100 people, 50 mention one specific plant, then we know that that specific plant has a frequency of citation of 50%, which is pretty high. And that shows cultural significance. So moving to look at the Jamaican survey just briefly, respondents identified their use of over 100 plants, so 107 plants that we were able to confirm the identity of botanically. And then of those, 14 plants met the criteria for inclusion based on frequency of citation. So here's the list of 14 plants here in Jamaica. So I won't go through them necessarily in any detail, but you've got the scientific name, the common name, the health issue that people reported using the plants for, how they were prepared. There's a lot more data, a lot more information, which is in the published paper, and then frequency of citation here. So we've got, as you can imagine, garlic, aloe vera, rice bitters, soursop, leaf of life. So there's 14 plants in that list. So if I just pick out a couple of plants, so Annona muricata, soursop, particularly the soursop leaf, people identified using it as a decoction or as an infusion for the treatment of nerves, particularly things like insomnia and nervous anxiety. So 83% of very, very high frequency of citation, and that was the highest frequency of citation of the plants that we shortlisted. And then I mentioned rice bitters. Rice bitters, we set a limit of 20%. So rice bitters just got in there at 21%. So Andrographis paniculata. Also worth mentioning that of the 14 plants, 13 had previously been mentioned in other TRAMIL surveys across the region. Andrographis paniculata, known as rice bitters in Jamaica, hadn't previously been mentioned in a TRAMIL survey, which I found quite interesting given the extensive knowledge of this medicinal plant and its value in healthcare. So yeah, so rice bitters, Andrographis paniculata makes it onto the TRAMIL database for the first time. So then we move on to number 5 in the methodology. So this is when you're looking at those significant plants. So in Jamaica's case, those 14 significant plants would then be on the database in the Pharmacopoeia. And these are referred to as SIGs, S-I-G, significant plants. So here we get into the body of the Pharmacopoeia, the Caribbean Pharmacopoeia. As I say, it's open to everybody, it's free access. So on the left, you can see, or at the top here, you've got all of your plants listed by scientific name. So on the left here, I'm just giving an example of letter A. And what you see is those plants that are highlit and have a little green icon next to them, those are plants that actually now have monographs. So all of the plants are listed because they're significant. They've been identified as having significant use, but not all of them have necessarily yet had monographs developed. So the highlighted ones are those that have got monographs attributable to them. So across the database, there are currently 422 plants listed. So these are 422 plants that have been identified with significant cultural use across the region. Not all of those have yet had monographs developed. So then we move on to number 6, which is the investigation of those significant plants. And this is called TRIGs, TRAMIL investigation. So the TR and the IGS gives you that, that name, TRIGs. So the TRIGs are then undertaken. And here you can see where the investigations are undertaken. So this is giving you the location of 12 laboratories currently undertaking these investigations, and that is across 10 countries. So 12 laboratories in 10 countries. And these are mainly academic institutions. So the survey results for each health problem and the plant part used are then compared with the existing scientific literature, and if necessary, additional pharmacological, chemical, or clinical tests, and these are what's classified as TRIGs, are then undertaken. And the TRIGs are performed in academic research labs following the scientific literature or experimental conditions that are established by TRAMIL. So those experimental conditions would be discussed at the TRAMIL workshops, and then recommendations from those workshops on what TRIGs are to be carried out in the different laboratories. If there's an abundance of data already in the scientific literature, then obviously TRIGs don't need to be performed. So TRIGs are really to plug the gaps where that information hasn't yet been undertaken. So their purpose, the purpose of TRIGs, is to verify the safety and to validate the traditional use of plant parts reported where they have significant use, as I mentioned, greater than 20% found in the surveys. So to date, more than 700 of those investigations have been conducted across the various university research centers in the Caribbean region. And there may be, I think there may also be other centers outside the Caribbean region who've volunteered to undertake research and contribute to the TRAMIL network. Okay, so number 7. Then we get into the recommendations, recommended plant remedies deemed effective for specific conditions that can be treated at home. And these plants are identified as recommended plants. So the TRAMIL methodology requires the demonstration of the effectiveness of the plant part and the specific means of administration in addressing a health problem. And just to re-emphasize this is a critical part of the TRAMIL methodology, which is the recognition that a particular part of a plant may be toxic, but that doesn't obviously mean that the whole plant is toxic. So the part that people report using is what is assessed using the TRAMIL methodology. So if people are using the leaves but not the root, then it's the leaf. If people are reporting that it's a water extract, which is predominantly the main method reported across the Caribbean, then it's that water extract that is tested and not another form. So we wouldn't be looking necessarily at a methanol extract or an ethanol extract unless that ethanol extract is part of what is reported. Okay, so that's very important. So this requirement is a key differentiator. So this recommendation is a key differentiator compared to many other ethnobotanical or ethnomedical studies in terms of what defines TRAMIL. And the proof of effectiveness is supported by the following. So where significant traditional use is established by TRAMIL surveys and subsequently shown to not be of concern in terms of toxicity, and we'll come on to that in a second. So significant traditional use established by the TRAMIL surveys, or results of published preclinical and/or clinical pharmacological research, or results of the research conducted by a TRAMIL group, the TRIGs that we just talked about. So those are the 3 levels at which effectiveness is supported before a recommendation is made. And then in terms of the safety, number 8 would look at discouraging the use of plant remedies that are shown to be toxic. And again, specific to the plant part that's been identified and specific to the preparation method that people have identified. So in order to get to that point of having a discouragement of the use of that plant remedy, and remember, this is despite the plant being found to be used extensively, for example, in a population. Subsequently, the recommendation would be to discourage use if toxicity is then subsequently shown. But to get to that point, we're looking at plants that have got significant traditional use based on the surveys, as we've talked about, but that there's evidence in the scientific literature of toxicity specific to the plant part used and the means of preparation. I'm repeating myself there, but probably not a bad thing to re-emphasize that. And then also based on toxicity studies, if they don't exist, based on toxicity studies, proving that toxicity from that identified plant part and for that reported use, if it's not reported in the literature. And again, that would be part of the TRIGs that are undertaken in that network of laboratories. So then we get into number 9, the recommendation or discouragement, the TOX or REC, that goes into forming the plant monograph that is then posted in the Caribbean Pharmacopeia. So if we take an example here, a plant that's widely used in Jamaica and came up on our shortlist, Petavera alliaceae, or Guinea henweed as it's known locally. So this you can see now is highlit and shows that it has a monograph attached to it. So again, and all of this is available on the website. If you go into it, you can see that this first level of information looks at significant uses. So what reported uses were found from the survey? So for example, here, a number of health conditions. So this lists those health conditions that were reported. So for flatulence, headache, rheumatism, flu, colds, digestive conditions, flu. Now you'll see flu is in there twice, and that's not a mistake, because flu is there both, there's 2 different preparations. One is a leaf preparation, decoction taken orally, and then the second flu use is from a root decoction that is taken orally. So headache, toothache, sinusitis, or locally people call it clogged nose, and muscle pain. So pretty extensive listing of local uses for that one plant. So then the next level is looking at, well, what's the reported preparation and dosage? So all of this information is recorded and made available. So for digestive conditions and cold, it tells you the preparation is a decoction using 3 spoonfuls of the ground leaf in a liter of water, 4 cups. Boil for at least 10 minutes in a covered pot. Filter, allow to cool, and drink 2 to 3 cups a day. So that's the preparation and dosage that comes with that recommended use. And then the recommendation here, according to the published and other information, this plant has been recommended by TRAMIL for use for digestive conditions, for toothache, for muscle pain, skin diseases, rheumatism, common cold, and is classified as REC, recommended, based on significant traditional use documented in TRAMIL surveys and toxicity studies. And it goes on to give some of the cautions in terms of its use as well. And here, the toxicity studies, those that were undertaken by TRAMIL network itself and those that are available in the literature. There's also sections which I haven't gone into that look at the phytochemistry, the chemical profile, what is known in the literature, and there's extensive research on this plant. And then the biological activities, so a lot of in vivo and vitro work. If there were clinical studies, those would also be listed in the biological activities. So fairly extensive, and all that information is made available on the website. So if we look at a plant that has, as I say, extensive use reported, we could look at a plant, Datura stramonium. As a lot of us know, Datura stramonium has a long history of traditional use, but is not considered to be a plant safely used by members of the general public. So in our surveys, people did report using it in a number of countries. In Haiti, it was reported extensively. So in Haiti, it's used for asthma, and that should be dyspnea. There's a spelling mistake there. So smoke of the dried flower and leaf inhaled, and for dyspnea, trouble breathing, smoke of the dried flower and leaf inhaled. But then looking at the recommendation, there's a warning and a discouragement of the use of this plant based on published and other information. So use of the flower and the dried leaf for asthma attack and dyspnea is classified as toxic by the TRAMIL database. So given the toxicity of the aerial parts of this plant, its use is discouraged regardless of how recognized its alleged therapeutic properties may be. And again, there's information on the toxicity studies, the phytochemistry, and the biological activities attributed to that plant. So how are we doing on time? Okay, so then moving on to the final part, number 10, is the community outreach aspects of the TRAMIL program. And this is known as TRAMIL diffusion, so TRADIF. So these are the outreach programs. And so here you again see across the region a map showing the workshops that have taken place and activities that are documented to have taken place. So far, 22 officially reported TRADIF events in 11 countries taking place across the Caribbean region. So TRADIF activities include, and if I had more time, we could just do a talk on the TRADIF events alone, because it's such an important part of the TRAMIL work. So TRADIF activities include community-based health promotion and education aimed at families, looking at supporting people to develop family and community gardens in health centers, schools, and botanical gardens, working with health professional training in continuing education programs, looking at human resource training in the health sector on including the topic of medicinal plant use in study programs, research to support the identification and scientific validation of medicinal plant uses, so ongoing TRAMIL surveys, and the promotion of the domestication and cultivation of scientifically validated medicinal plants according to the priorities of each country. Again, very much taking into account the potential issues around overharvesting and sustainability for plants that become very popular in a community. And a very detailed document exists on the site. I've given the, and hopefully, I think, well, the recording of this talk and the PowerPoint hopefully will be made available. And there's a link here to a very detailed document outlining the TRADIF program. So I think that brings me to the end. It's been 50 minutes. Hopefully I've given an overview of the TRAMIL methodology. So really to open up to any burning questions.
David, so it was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. So I have a question that, have you studied any psychoactive plant or religiously used plant for religious purposes?
I personally haven't. And it's interesting. I mean, in the TRAMIL survey, I don't know if it was because I was new to Jamaica and people were nervous about saying, but cannabis didn't actually feature widely in the survey, which I found interesting. But cannabis obviously would, or ganja as it's known locally, would be the main kind of psychoactive plant in Jamaica. Yeah. But it is used extensively, and it's used at a family level, I mean, it's used a lot with children as a tea for asthma and for eyesight problems. But yeah, no, I've not personally, but we do a lot of research at UWI on cannabis.
Okay, and for opium also, opium and datura is also psychoactive plant.
Datura is psychoactive, and it was interesting, datura didn't feature at all. It wasn't one of the 107 medicinal plants that people identified using. I mean, datura grows here, but it's mainly found growing in people's gardens, and most Jamaicans I know aren't aware of its medicinal use.
And any religiously used plant, religious purposes?
Yeah, I mean, definitely you will find, and we recorded that, there are a lot of, well, not a lot, but there are plants that have spiritual aspects to them. Things like, I mean, the one I could think of is spirit weed, is a plant that's used where people believe that it will support removing, in Jamaica, they're called duppies, so spirits that might consider to be wanting to harm a family or a person. There are plants that can be used to remove duppies or malevolent spirits from a particular yard. So yeah, we definitely recorded some of those.
Okay, thank you.
Just a note, you may raise your hand. You have to do a click on reactions below, or you can type your question here in the chat, whatever you would like. There is already another question, which is, I think you already more or less answered that one. What about spiritual and ritual uses of plants? I don't know if you want to say something else about this.
I mean, in terms of TRAMIL, as I mentioned, it was interesting because the starting point of the methodology is to identify, the key health conditions. But the spiritual aspects, I don't want to say that they're played down, but we definitely captured information about that. I mean, there is a focus probably more on the biomedical kind of approach to health conditions.
Yes.
But yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Sarah Edwards raised her hand.
Yeah, thank you, David. Lovely talk. I was just wondering, with the health conditions, were you purposely avoiding any sort of major health conditions? Because I noticed you had nothing on metabolic disorders like type 2 diabetes. Immordica charantia is sort of used a lot in Central America as an anti-diabetic plant. And I wondered whether you were recording that information as well, or cardiovascular plants used to.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That's a really good question. Yeah, we kind of, I mean, under the guidance of TRAMIL, we kind of stepped out of, well, we pushed the boundaries a little bit in terms of the health conditions. So we did actually capture, because and I'll probably get into trouble for saying this, but the original view of TRAMIL was not to step into areas that are predominantly treated by medical doctors. But I personally was very interested to find out, across the board, what health conditions people were treating. So, in Jamaica, as in many other countries, metabolic diseases and non-communicable diseases are a huge challenge. So we did capture that information. And Mormodica charantia, I mean, I didn't share it because I wanted to focus on the TRAMIL and not focus on the Jamaican survey. But Mormodica charantia was #1. I mean, it came out as #1 in terms of the most popular medicinal plant, and it continues to be. It was interesting that in the Jamaican context, people didn't necessarily identify their use of medicinal plant to treat diabetes directly, but they identified its use for things like blood cleanse and washout. But when you actually dig down deeper, which for me as a naturopath or medical herbalist is fascinating, because when you dig down a blood cleanse, often people would take a blood cleanse when they felt their sugar level was high. And they would take it particularly after mango season when they felt they'd eaten too many mangoes. So, and then cardiovascular, yeah, we captured a lot. So I think cardiovascular was up there in terms of the top conditions, particularly for things like hypertension. We have a high level of hypertension in the population, so a lot of plants identified for hypertension. So, Sarah, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. The next in line, I think, is Ella, and then we'll come to the chat questions.
Hi, David. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks,
I actually
Ella.
have two questions. So the first one, so I work with the Haitian diaspora in New York City, and I'm really interested, has TRAMIL done any work with like, you know, diasporas within the Caribbean? So like maybe like the Haitian community living in Dominican Republic or in Cuba? Has that been part of the work?
In terms of the diaspora, so people who are no longer living in Haiti.
Yes, but living in a different country in the Caribbean.
That's a good question. I think it would be really useful actually to link you with the TRAMIL network. I don't know if you.
Yes, I'd like to be. That'd be nice.
Yeah, because there's a very active TRAMIL
WhatsApp
group. Mm-hmm. So offline, let's talk about that, because it would
be great. Yeah,
get involved, and then you can have access to the TRAMIL network, and they're across, you know, multiple countries. So I can't necessarily answer that question. I know that obviously a lot of work, because that's where it started, it's been done in Haiti, but whether much work has been done on the diaspora is a good question.
Yeah, well, especially with, you know, how things are in Haiti right now. There's a lot, you know, a lot of people moving different places, so it'd be interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, I mean, that was just, I cited TRAMIL a lot when I was doing, and I looked at that when I was doing my basis for my ethnobotanical work in New York City. So it was cool to see that it was like, I didn't know it was the first one, but I was interested if, you know, that was done several decades ago. Is there any plans to kind of like redo some of those surveys more like now, since it's been a few decades?
Yeah, and I think what you see is the number of surveys. I can't remember the figures, like 50 surveys and 26. So I think a number of countries have done more than one survey.
Okay,
so
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, even, you know, Dr. Ina Vanderbroek and I've done work, and the work that we did just a few years ago, you know, plants that were coming up weren't mentioned in the TRAMIL survey that we did in 2008, 2009. So we all know it
changes over time. Yeah.
Yeah, often very, very fast moving, because people's influences online, etc., are changing all the time. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The next question here from Kirk Loss. When and where is the next TRAMIL workshop? Is one planned? I think he wants to sign up for the mailing list.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because there's so many things going on, and this is why, you know, I feel kind of bad, because there's so much I haven't highlighted in terms of, you know, the library, the maintenance of the library, and most of the people working on the TRAMIL network, if not all of the people, are volunteers. And there's so much. I mean, just putting this presentation together, you know, just made me realize just the depth and the breadth of the information in there. The last workshop was here in Jamaica, and normally I think the plan is to have workshops every 3 or 4 years. So I know that there must be another. So again, let me ask the question. And, you know, feel free to reach out if people want to get involved, if they want to get involved in the TRAMIL network, if they want access to the WhatsApp group. I can certainly find out how to get you onto the WhatsApp group. And then let me ask that question. I know that one of the planned activities is there's a print copy of the Pharmacopeia. So I think we're on the 3rd edition now. And I've been involved with colleagues at UWI in helping with the English translation, because it has to be there's an English version, a French version, and a Spanish version. So that's close to being approved. So that's so yeah. Let me ask that question.
Well, the questions are rolling in. The good thing about this format is that we are not really restricted in time. I don't know how is your time, David? Are you still?
I'm fine. I think Amelia said the line is open. She left it open for 2 hours. So I'm not saying we'll go for 2 hours, but yeah, we're good. We're good
Okay.
for a while.
The next question is, were plant samples and IDs taken at the same time as the surveys per household? It goes to the equivalence, no, of what people say and what plants they really need.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the way that I worked was, I was new in Jamaica. So they sent me around with a team. So there were normally always 2 or 3 people. Often we would only go into a community when we had a community member working with us. And so ideally, yes, we would collect samples at the time of survey. But if we weren't able to, then we would have to subsequently go back, but that wasn't ideal. But I think in terms of the TRAMIL methodology, that's the recommendation, that at the time or subsequently plant samples, but then you'd need to go back to the respondent to make sure that that's the plant that they meant and have them confirm that that's the plant that they had identified and were discussing and talking about.
Did you do your surveys in the main growing season, or is it just an advantage of working in the humid tropics that you mostly find most plants?
Yeah, it's pretty much. When did we start? I mean, I arrived in the January. We put the survey together, and probably by March, April, I was out in the field, and then over the next 6 months. So yeah, it was pretty exhaustive over that 6-9 month period.
Well, next question. Is there any attention given to whether species are introduced? And if so, how long the species has been present in the Caribbean?
Yeah, I mean, we looked, it wasn't a major focus for the TRAMIL survey, but definitely we look at what's native, what's endemic, what's introduced. And probably worth me saying something here as well, because TRAMIL's involved in so I represent TRAMIL, for example, at the moment, in a group. We had a conference 2 years ago, which was supposed to be a face-to-face conference in Brazil, but ended up being online because of COVID. But out of that, there's a focus on actually developing a Pan-American Pharmacopeia. And TRAMIL is obviously a significantly important resource for that. So this is a long-term project on the basis, and that's looking at trying to focus mainly on native plants. And I know it's a contentious issue, because certainly in Jamaica, so many of our medicinals are introduced. So I could talk for ages. Yeah. So I don't know if I answered that question. So rein me in if I'm going off on a tangent, but
Don't worry. So it is something you are considering, but not really focusing on something like that.
It is, and certainly in the work that Dr. Vanderbroek's done and I've done, we've been very much looking at that balance between native and introduced. The challenge comes when, I mean, I don't want to start a whole debate, but in the Caribbean in particular, when something becomes naturalized. So, for example, the Taino came from Central South America, many years, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So they were the indigenous population that were here when the Europeans first arrived. And they introduced a number of plants, most notably cassava. So that's been in Jamaica for hundreds and hundreds of years. So yeah, at what point does a plant become classified as native as opposed to introduced?
Yeah.
I know that opens up a
whole
whole
new
debate
can of
itself.
worms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, thank you. Next question. How was the identification of the samples authenticated, and how was the dosage finalized? Because I imagine that everybody that there is some variation in the information you get.
Yeah, so two separate issues there. So the identification, certainly for the surveys that we did, and again, this is published Journal of Ethnopharmacology, so our vouchers were submitted to the UE Herbarium and confirmed there. But I think across TRAMIL, the methodology does specifically state that, you know, voucher specimens have to be provided in either university herbaria or national herbaria. So hopefully that answers the first question. The second question, I don't necessarily feel qualified to answer because that's the work, and there's a lot of work goes into that. That's the work of the different groups that get together to look at the data within TRAMIL, to review the monographs. And so before a monograph can be published, I'm just looking at notes that one of my TRAMIL colleagues, Jeanette, sent. So the CCRIB process. So there's an organization within TRAMIL that proposes and reviews monographs, and they have to go through that review process and be validated for safety and security before the network is allowed to publish both online and in print. So yeah, there's quite a rigorous process in looking at the traditional preparation, the plant part used, and those are listed both online and listed in the print-based publications. And I think that's what really, I wouldn't say makes it unique, but that's what really stands out in terms of what TRAMIL brings to the table in terms of being able to go back into communities and take that knowledge back in. I mean, that knowledge has come from the communities, but there are people obviously in the community that might not have that level of knowledge. So to be able to take that knowledge back into the communities is a key aspect of the TRAMIL methodology. So I hope that answers the question. So it's a
dosage is basically determined by the groups that revise the monographs, and
yes.
also perhaps some biochemical knowledge that you have on the plant.
Oh, somebody's just messaged me. The beauty of WhatsApp. So Jeanette's just messaged me. So medical doctors in the CCRIB group recommend dosage based on information from the surveys. So, yeah, it is actually a very, and it takes, you know, it does take time, but it's a very exhaustive process before a monograph with dosage recommendations is put back out into communities.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Also a question, did you explore the food and other uses of some of the medicinal plants?
Did we look at the food uses? I suppose the easy answer to that is no. We were looking at, as I say, the starting point is the health condition that people identified. So, you know, if you've identified your short list of health conditions, and then you go in and ask the respondent to say, have you suffered from any of these health conditions? And they say, oh, yes, and, you know, in the Jamaican survey, we limited it to 12 months because we wanted to ensure that we weren't getting recall bias being introduced. I'm being told, yeah, so the nutritional aspects have been covered apparently, where applicable in monographs. So whether it's captured at the point of survey, probably not. But if there is shown to be nutritional value, that would be included in the monographs, if I'm correct there.
from the literature or from
Yeah.
data collected more or less.
So in the field during the survey, no, you're probably going to be focused mainly on the health condition and then identifying the plants that are used for that health condition. And then subsequently that plant. So for example, you know, we didn't really get many people, if any, identifying the use of moringa, but now it's widely used in Jamaica. So moringa obviously has both medicinal uses, and that would get identified if we were to do it again. That would be identified in the survey based on the health condition, but then subsequently in writing the monograph, the significant nutritional value would then be picked up from that research and included then in the monograph, I think, if I'm correct.
Okay. While everybody thinks about other questions, I have some. First of all, did you have a lot of difficulty of finding the equivalence between what people perceive as health conditions and what is accepted as a health condition in Western medicine, which is basically your standard, isn't it?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. And I know rereading the methodology, the recommendation TRAMIL has is that doctors and biomedical practitioners don't do the survey, which sounds kind of
yeah.
But it's the nuance, because I think the idea is that, you know, you should be going in there with an open book, and your idea of a health condition, when you actually open up and ask somebody, they may say to you, oh, I get a headache. But then you find out, as the first questioner said, they may actually say, well, no, the headache has a spiritual aspect. And then, you know, if you came at it in a very rigid kind of way, you wouldn't necessarily pick up on that nuanced kind of approach. And then you'd find out, well, you know, if you have a headache, generally, I might take this plant, but I knew that somebody had worked something on me and therefore I took this plant. Now that you can pick up. Yeah.
Well, here in Mexico, we have the thing that people sometimes use words of Western medicine to describe something that is not really Western medicine.
Absolutely.
So,
and so we've been very careful to not discount that. So, you know, as across the Caribbean, there's a lot of emphasis on blood cleansing and washout, which would be discounted or disparaged often in a biomedical kind of setting. So no, we're very careful. I think the TRAMIL methodology is very careful to be culturally appropriate, for sure.
So your descriptions also include local perceptions of.
Yeah, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And I think my experience with the work in Jamaica was, as I said, I haven't necessarily picked it up in TRAMIL, but this emphasis in Jamaica on maintaining health. So again, if you were only focused on health problems, you wouldn't pick up on the fact. And we had a lot of people reporting their use of tonic plants to maintain health, plants, and, you know, in a Jamaican context, aphrodisiacs. So aphrodisiacs that make you feel good and improve sexual function, you know, a lot of those are mentioned. And again, if you only focused on health problems, then you wouldn't necessarily pick up on those. But we picked up a lot on tonics, on plants that really sustain and invigorate and maintain health, not necessarily just to treat illness.
I think that a lot of traditional health care systems have this focus on maintaining. Do you have this concept of maintaining balances? You know, as you know, probably that here in Mesoamerica, you have this dual vision of hot and cold, which is a subject that one of my students works on. Do you find that and you need to maintain a balance, and if you have an imbalance, you get sick? Do you have that concept in the Caribbean?
Very much so. And I think, you know, a lot has been, oh, not necessarily a lot, but there has been There are publications and people have looked at that from a historic perspective, where that comes from. 90% of the population in Jamaica are of African descent. So, when you look at African traditional medicine, you'll see, a very strong spiritual aspect, divination, speaking through people in terms of connecting with ancestral knowledge. So that all of those aspects you have to take into account in the Caribbean. And then the aspect of hot and cold, the aspect of humors is a key part, and how that's been kind of mixed, coming from the mixing of the European.
Has anybody worked on this fusion of African and, I suppose, Mesoamerican and European concepts of illness?
Yeah, I think from an anthropological point of view, from an ethnobotanical point of view, it's a huge area, and we're just kind of touching on it.
So there have been publications, because well, I don't know, I'm asking. Okay.
Amongst SEB members, I know that there've been some amazing papers on this very subject. So yeah, it's widely looked at.
Well, I think there are no more questions. Anybody? Last chance? Well, then we thank David a lot. We should have these conversations more often about our work, life's work, or Ella?
Oh no, I was just clapping, sending the clapping emoji.
Thank you very much, David, for your time. And as I said, we should talk more with each other a little bit extensively between the members of the society and also some non-members, perhaps. But people should become members, for those of you who are not. Okay? It's not so expensive, and it's very nice to go to the meetings. And we have quite a few other events that are sometimes open to non-members and sometimes open only to members. We will have a fall symposium online, so please become members. And any other comment? Then I think we can again say thank you to David, and thank you to everybody who was participating. And I think that will end this event.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks for the opportunity to present on TRAMIL.